Thank you, Salil. And first, I have to apologize. I have a terrible cold, and so one, there may be some vague feverish hallucinations involved in the slides, and two, my voice may give out halfway through. We'll see how that goes. But in terms of, I'm very happy to give this talk as the last circus talk, because this is an example of a great project that comes from projects like Circus. At the Kennedy School talking about various issues in cyber policy, and I come back and start chatting with my office mate, Tyler Moore, who is an expert in the economics of information security, and we spend a long time at a whiteboard sort of building various different types of models, and then in comes Ariel, who is an expert in game theory, and says, oh, well, actually, it's closer to this, and in a week and a half, we've banged out a paper. And I'm going to talk to you about this paper and from the policy side. So if you've been reading the paper for a while, you may have sort of noticed that there's been an uptick in how much people are talking about information security. And on one hand, if you've been doing information security for a long time, this is great because people are now paying attention to what you're doing. On the other hand, it also seems very resonant with this old flavor of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. People sort of conflating cybercrime with espionage, with war, and we've got this hodgepodge of crazy ideas. So this is a book by two Chinese colonels on a new approach to warfare. And its English translation was translated in 2002, and a very opportunistic, dodgy publisher printed 1 million copies with this cover to get your attention. But the strategy it talks about is, well, you know, United States is unequivocally dominant in just about every aspect of military power. So what can we do if we wanted to tangle with the United States? How can the United States be defeated? And you know, it talks about this concept of Shajualin, which, forgive my pronunciation to anyone who could pretend to understand that, which is the assassin's mace, or in cyber terms you might think of it as the killer app. How do you attack a very narrow aspect of your opponent, particularly their command and control and intelligence infrastructures? So the key aspect here, this framing, is that we've got asymmetric warfare. And the United States is the dominant piece, and we have adversaries that are trying to attack us in this new domain. And there have been a number of incidents. Titan Rain, which is the code name for widespread surveillance of the unclassified NIPRNet, the DoD network. GhostNet, where we had large spread surveillance of governmental agencies throughout Southeast Asia. And reports of espionage in the power grid, all tying back to adversaries of the United States, and trying to sort of understand how should we think about this if our adversaries are going to be coming at us in the cyber domain. So by the way, this is the original cover, which is far more Star Wars-like, but still captures this idea that information, we have satellites and laser beams and whatnot, being a key aspect. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of revisit this idea of cyber warriors and why this is on the front page and what's going on very briefly in the US government. We have with us a representative of the Armed Forces who's going to be heading there in a few months into Cyber Command. And I'm going to then present two different game theory models that we can use to look at how the United States, or indeed any two parties, might think of engagement in the cyber context. I'm going to talk a little about another aspect that's very popular in the economics of information security on vulnerability rediscovery, and then I'm going to sort of say what are the lessons we can draw from this for cyber policy. So why are we talking about cyber war? So again, revisiting this idea that the United States is dominant. We've got some great new ways of attacking systems, and sort of natural that, you know, as soon as we have this context for, you know, attack and defense, someone's going to say, hey, let's think about how we can use this in war. This is sort of the nature of humanity. All technology, if it does not originate in the military context, ends up in that context. But we sort of have to go back farther, and I've now been in enough military strategy talks to know that you always have to have this guy up here, when you're talking about military strategy. And this is, for those who aren't aware, this is Sun Tzu. And Sun Tzu is brilliant because he says you should never use the word asymmetric warfare, because all warfare is asymmetric. By definition, success in warfare comes from exploiting your enemy's weaknesses and maximizing your strength, taking advantage of your strength. So it is very, very natural then that we would look around our position and say we have incredible strength in all conventional warfare, and we are incredibly dependent, both militarily and for our civilian success, on information systems and network technology. This is therefore a vulnerability that we should start to think about. We also want to bring in this guy, who is John Nash, who is the founder of game theory and indeed one of the first people to look at warfare and security issues through the lens of game theory. And in particular, trying to reduce conflicts down to known issues. For example, an arms race where two people are trying to build up weapon stocks can often be modeled as prisoner's dilemma, where both parties should, in an ideal world, stand down, but neither of them has the incentive to do so, and instead you end up with a race towards the top or the bottom, depending on your perspective and whether you're an arms contractor. Another approach you can think of is the game of chicken, which is likened to first strike capability, usually not in a nuclear context, but I can attack you or you can attack me. If we both attack at the same time, we'll end up in horrific trench warfare. That's the worst case. If we both just sort of sit on our haunches or retreat, we both lose a little bit, and you end up with a stable equilibrium where if I know that you're going to defend, I'll attack, and vice versa. So you have this sort of, it's a way of thinking about the game similar to the chicken race. So we have a number of ways of thinking about warfare in general. How can we apply it? And why should we apply it? Well, we have this new institution coming up called Cyber Command. Now, a very brief bit of history. Over the past 10, 15 years, I guess over the past 30 years, even longer, the National Security Agency has developed excellent capacity for understanding and manipulating information systems. This grew out of its original core mission for signals intelligence, and it is seen by just about any observer you can talk to as the world leader by twofold, if not an order of magnitude, in understanding how to exploit information systems, writ large. We now compare this with a new focus inside the US military for looking into this new domain. US military maps, the Department of Defense maps warfare into domains. We have land, air, sea, and space. And there is a lot of discussion about should we view this cyberspace as a new domain where we can talk. Now, there's a long history in the Department of Defense of finding new ways to enhance your budget. And starting with the Air Force, there's been a rise in all three services primarily of saying, yes, cyber attack and cyber defense is core to our mission. So this came to a head in the mid-2000s, and a political compromise was created a year or two ago that said we will have this cyber command, which will be parallel to NSA, and it will basically regulate the control of attack and defense of networks and information systems with NSA capacity aiding strength, but it will be part of the defense mission. An important footnote here is that there are statutory distinctions between intelligence and national defense, which I'm glossing over for the sake of time. Yes? That is two excellent questions into the guise of one question. One is it useful to draw the distinction between surveying a system and doing bad stuff to a system? And that is, I think, an entire another talk. And I've had conversations with some of you here about this, that the distinction between surveillance and attacking is not as useful if you are talking about, a building, you can either look inside or blow it up, versus a computer system where in many cases, if you can see what's on the system, you are very close to being able to run an arbitrary code on the system. Not always, but there's overlap. So that's the first part. And the second part is, does the NSA do this? And that I don't have information on. I have no reason to believe that anyone inside the national intelligence community has anything but the highest respect for Title 10 versus Title 50 distinctions of intelligence versus national security. What is interesting to note, however, is if you want to take an offensive action under the guise of the intelligence community, you need permission from essentially the executive, the commander-in-chief. It goes all the way up. However, if you phrase something as a national security operation under the military authority, then essentially it is just a standard operation, and as soon as you have a larger mission in which to frame it, there is no need to go all the way up to seek executive authority. So we have this idea of a large push in the defense community to understand the cyberspace and to gain and maintain dominance and an advantage. Now, what are the priorities of the Cyber Command? So in 2006, we had the first national military strategy for cyberspace operations. This is General Pace, who was the head of the Joint Chiefs at the time. This has since been reaffirmed by Admiral Mullen, who's the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs. It says that national strategy we want to maintain is maintaining a robust defense in cyberspace while exploiting adversary vulnerabilities. So note that this is key to our mission, is we need to both defend and be able to attack. And this is where this paper is going to focus on this trade-off. So the trade-off between attack and defense is not new. I'm assuming enough people know what this building is. Anyway, Bletchley Park. So the trade-off between attack and defense is not new. In fact, there are some wonderful stories from World War II about having intelligence and having to decide between to act on intelligence to defend yourself or maintain the security of your intelligence stream for future advantages. This is the signals intelligence, Sigint, versus operational security trade-off. I've had a number of off-the-record conversations about how this trade-off is manifest more recently, but really you see a lot of discussion of this in World War II and some very interesting myths about what Churchill knew and what he didn't know. If you would like to see an excellent discussion of this, I recommend you read Neil Stephenson's wonderful novel, Cryptonomicon, which explores this trade-off as a major theme. But this basic idea that there are going to be instances in a national security context where we'll have to choose between exploiting an operational advantage, an offensive advantage, and promoting operational security. Now, as a trade-off, this isn't all that interesting because it's usually who has the more authority or more presence in the room where this decision is made. Traditionally in the United States, we have prioritized signals intelligence. The NSA sort of has a lot more sway when decisions are made than some of the other things. Again, discussions with some experts have suggested that during the Cold War, Russia had the opposite approach, that they prioritized operational security at the expense of intelligence, which seems like a fairly natural response to United States prioritization on intelligence. So what we're going to do in this paper is talk about the trade-off between taking action and security, between exploiting a vulnerability and defending our own systems. So let's talk a little bit about the assumptions that I'm going to make in this trade-off game. So first, the models I'm going to be presenting today are all two-player, and we can talk about how to generalize that and whether it's important or not to generalize that. Second, we're going to be focusing on discovering a single new vulnerability. So this is not a question of patching known vulnerabilities. I do some other work on the organizational context of how do you, once you know that there's a vulnerability, actually get your organization to behave in a compliance fashion. What we're interested in now is saying that there's the opportunity to find a new vulnerability. And this is something that both sides are trying to do. In a common system. So yes, every country, every organization has unique features of its own information system. However, there's a lot of commonalities. We both use, all sides have a predominantly Microsoft-based computing base. We use very similar routers, very similar protocols. Even the SCADA systems are quite similar because we've sold it to them and they've built it for us. So there's a very common knowledge base that has led to a shared system between both sides. Much of this talk, as you might have guessed from the early promotion, was sort of driven by the mentality of US versus China. This is not explicitly to provoke. This is just as a handy reference point to motivate this talk. And I'll expand on a couple of other examples as I go through. And the most important assumption that I have here is that closing a vulnerability on our side precludes the ability to further exploit it, either us against them or them against us. This means that when we come up with a way, when we decide to defend, we essentially are reducing this to instantaneous protection of all of our systems. And moreover, we can't then exploit this on their side. Now, why would this be a valid assumption? One, if it's a common platform that both of us use, then we can say, well, the only way to close a vulnerability efficiently in a Microsoft operating system, for example, is to tell Microsoft releases a patch. We can't stop them from using it. So, vendor-related patches is the most obvious approach. But you can also imagine scenarios if we have close surveillance of each other's information systems. When you detect a change in someone else's system, you can start looking and saying, oh, why did they do that? And then very quickly reverse engineer what they did and defend yourself. So that is, again, a key assumption that this model rests on. So we're going to walk through this trade-off where someone discovers a vulnerability and has to make a decision. So this is the very basic model here, where player one, in blue, has discovered a new vulnerability. And they have a choice of either defending, or in this case, we're going to say they're going to be stockpiling this vulnerability. We're not in an attack mode. We're just going to say that they derive some valuable utility of having a vulnerability that they can exploit in their opponent's system. Now, they have a choice of either stockpiling it, down here, or, defending. They defend, they don't get anything, they don't lose anything. It's just you've now reverted your system to the previous level of security. You've done good, but you haven't gained any advantage. If you decide to stockpile, now we turn to nature. And nature decides whether our adversary can rediscover the vulnerability. Now, if our adversary does not rediscover the vulnerability with probability P, we have an advantage, positive one, and they have a disadvantage, negative one. This just captures some advantage we have over our adversary, for strategic purposes. Now, I also include a delta here, which is going to be the social cost of an unpatched system. And one of the themes of this talk is going to be that all other things equal, systems should be patched. We should have a more secure world. And this is a way of building this exclusively into the model of decision makers. Are the decision makers viewing, do the decision makers view a social cost that they are aware of? And you can think of this as the risk of crime, the risk of a third party exploiting, et cetera, et cetera. It's just you have something, what is the negative utility you have of leaving your system open? Beyond this idea that someone else might discover it. So if they don't discover it, player one derives positive value, player two derives negative value. And if you are not familiar with this approach to game theory, then raise your hand and I will walk through this more carefully. If they rediscover it, now player two has a choice. Player two can choose to defend, in which case, again, they've now precluded player one from exercising the option of exploiting, and they've defended themselves. So again, we have this idea of mutual security once again, no harm, no foul. Or alternatively, they can stockpile it. Now, if both of them have the same vulnerability, we're going to say that neither has a strategic advantage. We're going to revisit that in the future. However, both of them have the negative utility, negative delta, of this social insecurity. So, yes?
In this scheme,
The cost associated with stockpiling, simply, is simply the social cost of your unpatched system. So that is what you get from not defending. There is no, however, there's no load to bear, unlike, a missile silo or something like that. Yes? That's an excellent point, that one could imagine a system where, and I'm going to expand this to the full stockpile model game, where we see both sides. But you can imagine an area where if you have a vulnerability against me, that's the company jewels, whereas if I can attack you, that just inconveniences you a little bit, perhaps denies you access availability for a short period of time. So that's not explicitly built into this model. Yes, Ian? It is funny that you should mention that. So this is building in both sides, where there is an uncertainty of whether you are, well, you know you're player one. What you don't know is whether you are the first person to discover it with probability P, or if you are the second person. So we have it now, what is it called, an information set, where player one could be here and does not know where they are in this tree. The payoffs, however, are the same from the previous system. You have, anytime any player chooses to defend, everyone gets a clean slate. And every time you have someone who has the unique advantage, either player one or player two, they get +1 and -1, as well as some social cost, because having the advantage and not having defended yourself, being at a disadvantage and not defending yourself, means that you're now at a disadvantage to your adversary and you still have this social cost. So, yes, are there questions about sort of the overall model? Yes? Mm-hmm. So this is, you're exactly right. The game that I've framed here is for a single vulnerability. And we'll talk at the end about what the consequences may be of having this as a repeated game. But this is really just looking at a single vulnerability and what the decision anyone might make having discovered that. Excuse me, I just need to grab a napkin here. Sorry about this. It's the joy of luck that you wait for it to get absolutely warm before you catch a cold. I always like to do this. Yes? So, and we're going to revisit this idea of the probability of rediscovery later. Right now, what we're going to say is that P, thank you for mentioning that, P is essentially your technical competence. And if they are equal, they have an equal chance of discovery and then rediscovery. If P is 1 in this case, then player 2 will never discover it first and will never discover it second. They just will never have that. So we can think of this as technical competence, or more precisely, ability to discover vulnerabilities in a common system. I'm sorry? I'm sorry, I still didn't hear. So yes, we have this idea that we in a second, when we talk about equilibria, we will actually explore what happens as we vary P. And in fact, that is an excellent segue. Very good at sort of moving the talk along. But there was a question over here. A stockpile is this taking this vulnerability, and having it in your pocket as something you can use against your adversary in the future. The awareness of it, yes. So this is a strategic advantage that you now know you have. Yes, Joe. Exploiting the advantage we will talk about in the next game. But for the moment, we're in a sort of a Cold War model of where you derive utility by just having something your adversary doesn't. This is something that has been well fleshed out in both conventional and nuclear war, and so we wanted to apply this to the cyber war context. So how do we compute equilibria? I'm not going to walk you through the math. I'm going to show you a graphic in a second, but essentially, you just compute the total probabilities of each point in the graph where you could be. What is the probability that you'll end up at each payout locus? And what we're interested in doing is finding out what are the strategies that someone should play. And we're going to use Nash equilibria, fixed equilibria. We're not going to talk about mixed strategy where someone might randomize between two options. We're only going to look at a single strategy you might play. Will you play, will player one play, stockpile all the time? What will player one play in response to player two? And we get a graphic that looks a little like this. This is the equilibrium for stockpiling game now. How do we understand this? The y-axis is our delta. That's the harm that you get in just by having an unpatched system. And the x-axis is P. And you can think of P again as technical competence. When P equals 1, player 1 has the complete technical advantage. When P equals 0, player 2 has the complete technical advantage. This is just a relative metric. This is not an absolute metric. Similarly, social cost of 0, the only benefit from the game is in having an advantage that your adversary does not. And when delta equals 1, you now have equally outweighed the probability of defense. So what can we say about these equilibria? Well, first we notice that when delta is low, when there is very little social cost, there is no incentive for anyone to patch their system. Everyone is always going to play the stockpile option. So this, how do we interpret this, by the way? The paired tuple here, this is the strategy of the first player. This is the strategy of the second player. So up here in the blue zone, DS means that player 1 will play defend and player 2 will play stockpile. I'll get to that area in just a second. So why does everyone play aggressively when there are low social costs? It's because the harms of exposure are not dramatic. And everyone would really rather have the advantage, have the positive probability of having the drop on the adversary. So what's interesting here is this zone of attack, where no one is defending their system, is actually greatest when the two adversaries are equally matched. When one of them has a stronger advantage, they're less likely to be in an area, you're more likely to be in an area where at least someone is going to play defensively. You maximize the absorbable social cost when both players are playing, when both players are equally paired. This is a very interesting finding, I feel, because usually we assume that you're going to have wildly unfair advantages when one player has the advantage. Whereas in this case, we see that pairing actually leads to what I would consider a socially suboptimal outcome, where no one is thinking about defending the system. So looking at this case, when player 1 has very low technical advantage, they are likely to defend, and player 2 is going to attack. When you're unlikely to have the advantage, you're much more concerned with the social costs that you might suffer. This goes back to predicting where you are on the tree. If you know that if your player 1 knows that P is low, they're worried about the social cost. So, and of course it's symmetric, so player 2 is going to behave similarly defensive when they're going to when they have the advantage. And it's important to notice, however, that from a social perspective, and I'll talk about this a little at the end, from a social perspective, we don't derive too much from player 1 having a defensive strategy, since they're relatively unlikely to be in a position to discover it either first or second. So we don't have that. We're still interested in a world where someone's playing defensively, but on these sides of the spectrum, we're going to have more often the stockpiler is going to be the one who will find the vulnerability. Now, as social cost grows, we have large interest in avoiding the social cost. Everyone wants someone to play defensively. So now we have these two equilibria, which are very interesting, where as soon as one player knows the other player will play defensively, they're going to play aggressively. Whereas if I know the other player is going to play aggressively, then I want to make sure that I'm still covered from the social perspective, so I'm going to play defensively. This leads to some very interesting work on signaling issues, which is sort of outside the scope of the game we've talked about, but something that has been integrated into defensive strategy and international relations approaches, particularly in the nuclear context. Now, what's interesting to notice here is that the game that we're actually playing changes as we change the social cost. This outcome equilibria, where no matter what someone else does, it's still in your best interest to stockpile, looks a little bit like the final equilibria that we see in Prisoner's Dilemma. And in fact, if you draw out the payoffs, it will look like a Prisoner's Dilemma game. Similarly, when the social cost is high and both parties are equally paired, you're going to see something that looks like the game of chicken, where the important thing is to understand what the other person is going to do and react accordingly. If they're defensive, you're going to be offensive, and vice versa. Okay. Now, we had several questions of people saying, well, all right, it's all well and good to stockpile. This Cold War model is fine. But, you know, frankly, I became a computer scientist because I wanted to break other people's systems. So when are we going to actually have the opportunity to do that? Well, we're going to talk about that in this game, the Cyber Hawk game. Yes. Sure.
So are all the game, all strategies shown here are pure?
Yes, these are all pure strategy.
And in this game, all the equilibria type, or are there mixed strategy equilibria?
There are some mixed equilibria. We did not consider that in this game because that adds another layer of complexity on top of that. And in fact, you'll find that in fact there's a full range of covering mixed strategy here. We were interested in sort of building a model that was similar to what we know about international relations, which is that a mixed equilibria doesn't really mean much, for example, in the case of chemical warfare. You were interested in having some good information. Where that really comes into play is up in this space, where it's very important to understand what your adversary is going to do before you select your own strategy. And our game does not provide any information about that. Yes?
Since we're talking about very consistent vulnerabilities, in your model you assume that there is only a single vulnerability that
Yes.
you're building. In real life, probably there are multiple of them.
Yep.
And what gets tricky is that they may interfere with each other.
Mm-hmm.
So if you decide to stockpile in case 1 and case 2 and case 3, suddenly you may be opening up the whole
Yes. You're completely right. This paper is in part built on this realization that in much of what we understand about attack and defense in information systems, it is this idea of a multiple level threat and understanding where your system is vulnerable and how your system is vulnerable. What makes this approach different and why we sort of have introduced this is now we have the same player who's looking at both sides. There are some sophisticated models that look at how do you exploit a system, how do you spend your defense budget, given that your attacker has to do several different things at once in order to successfully exploit you. We haven't built that into this game yet. And as such, you can sort of think of this as, what is a vulnerability? A vulnerability is the set of things you need to know in order to successfully exploit. So we've reduced it down to that. But you're right, that adds another layer of complexity. Yes, in the back. Yes. Yes, we are. And I'm going to talk about that a little later in the policy approach. Yeah. Sorry.
Somewhat confused about the big purple area. So if you're, say, up in the upper right-hand corner,
Mm-hmm.
you get these huge social costs. You get a really small probability of your opponent figuring out what's going on. Why does it make a difference what your opponent's strategy is? Wouldn't you just want to defend at that point?
If you are, say, up here.
Yeah, up in the upper right, or upper
Okay.
left corner. Why wouldn't you care about the other party? They're not going to find it anyway. Wouldn't you just go for defense because
Well, as long as you're below this line, sorry, the top line, you still have your value of attack is greater than your value of defense. And you'll see it sort of follows this slope up for player one's case as you have an increase or a decrease in the ability to track down, to believe that you're the person who's going to discover it first. So as long as someone plays this case, then you're still hoping for that added advantage. There's no case where, under this model, as long as there's still some positive outcome of having the advantage, you're still going to look for that advantage of having the drop. And where you're interested in the mixed equilibrium is when you know that the other person isn't going to have the drop on you. Does that make sense? We can talk about it later, or I can refer you to the full paper. Okay, so we have a Cyberhawk game, which you'll notice is very similar to our stockpile game, except now, instead of having this payoff of stockpile, we have a further component here, where there's another chance aspect of who's going to be the first one to attack. And with parameter Q, according to the probability Q, it's going to be player 1. And 1 minus Q, it is going to be player 2. And you can think of this as the aggressiveness or the speed of weaponization or just the willingness to use a cyber weapon. So you could think of this as attacking or actually perpetrating espionage. It doesn't have to be, turning off the lights. This can just be, I'm going to take advantage of this vulnerability to do arbitrary aspect. The first person to use it wins, and the first person to use it is a probabilistic approach of Q. Okay. Any questions here? So the game is still going to be about whether to defend or not, but now it's going to be to attack or defend rather than stockpile to defend. And we also acknowledge, one, this depends on a mutual understanding of Q, and I'm going to talk about that in a second. And the other thing to notice about this game is, for simplification, we've taken out social cost because you're not sitting on a long vulnerability. You're not sitting on a vulnerability that you could shut off. It's whoever's going to use it first. And also now it becomes interesting because it becomes a zero-sum game. That everyone either wins or loses. Yes?
So, if I understand correctly, you only have this chance thing happening after both players have...
Once both players have the vulnerability, yes.
Both players have the vulnerability. It seems sort of like, given that I discovered it first, you have a higher chance of being the one to exploit it first.
So that's captured in this notion. It's now rolled into this idea of technical dominance. That if you find it and the other person doesn't, then you're inevitably going to use it. And so there's a little bit of hand waving, but I would say that is not completely ignored in this model. One could introduce an added component, but then how would you? So that introduces a time component. We initially talked about building a continuous closed-form model. Love to discuss that with someone else there. The chief problem is how do you handle either an infinite or finite stock of vulnerabilities for rediscovery? Very hard to model rediscovery. So we're going to, again, compute our equilibria of when is someone going to play attack and when is someone going to play defend. And we end up with a map that looks a little like this. Again, we have relative technical ability on the x-axis, and the y-axis is likelihood of attacking. At when the Q equals 1, player 1 is going to be almost always more likely to attack, or in fact always likely to attack. And when Q equals 0, they are never going to attack. So, how do we interpret these axes? Well, what's interesting to notice is, again, when we have equally paired adversaries in the center, when both parties are likely to attack and both parties are relatively equivalent from a technology perspective, again, we have this very, very aggressive space where no one is going to play defend. Everyone is going to attack the other person if possible. So the opportunity of uniquely discovering it trumps any desire to defend. Now, what's interesting is when we go to these far corners, you see that no level of technical dominance will dissuade an adversary that believes it's more likely to use a weapon. So here we see that player 1 is completely dominant, but relatively unlikely to use the weapon, and the converse is true up here. And when we have that case, both players are going to behave aggressively. And that's very important to notice that essentially you can think of them as complementary values. If I have technical competence, but I worry that my opponent is bellicose, I'm going to still have a very aggressive posture, even if I know that I'm not very likely to use the weapon myself. Also noteworthy here is relative technical ability means that I'm going to be aggressive, regardless of everything else. So all along this axis, as player 1 is aggressive, they're going to play the attack strategy. And similarly, all along this side, player 2 is going to play the attack strategy, regardless of how warlike the opponent is. Now, again, here we want to notice that technical dominance is something that the United States has spent a lot of time talking about, that we're interested in dominating this domain. And when we talk about dominance, we usually talk about offensive dominance. And if offensive dominance really is a strategy, this model predicts that it's going to lead to wanting to take an aggressive posture, wanting to attack, regardless of what your opponent does. So when do we have these defensive areas? Well, states are going to adopt defensive postures when they are unlikely to use their weapon and when they have relatively low technology skills compared to their other opponent. Now, what's interesting here is the dark blue area is where I actually have technical dominance, but because my likelihood to weaponize is low enough, I'm still going to, if I discover it, make sure that I'm going to play defensively because I don't want the other person to then get the drop on me. Again, we notice that there is no situation where both players are going to play defensively. You're always going to have someone who's willing to attack, and again, the defensive player is the one who's usually the least likely to discover this vulnerability. Now, just a fun little bit of interpretation here. Let's talk about the US-Russia relationship. Russia, in this domain of cybersecurity, has been very vocal in pushing for a series of treaties about disclosing and limiting use of cyber offensive capability. And what we want to do, what they've been arguing for, is the ability to say, let's limit our reactions. So what this means is they're trying to essentially, if they can get us to commit to signing this treaty, and we follow this treaty, that will then lower our relative Q, keeping us in a defensive posture. If they believe that they are worried about the United States in an attack posture, then this is something that you can imagine someone trying to do is move you up or down the queue through diplomatic aspects. I'm going to talk more about that later. But now I want to address something that someone brought up earlier, which is this question that if you go back to the game earlier, we assume, we assume here that probability of initial discovery is the same variable as probability of rediscovery. That this is the sort of your technical ability to discover something is the same thing as your technical ability to rediscover it. But it turns out that vulnerability rediscovery is a very big issue in the economics of information security. It's very contentious. There's a very large policy debate about if you discover a vulnerability, if you're just a random security researcher, if you discover a vulnerability, should you quietly tell the vendor or should you threaten to announce it publicly? And the assumption goes in this world that if we have a risk of independent rediscovery, then you will have vendors who are very, very concerned about rediscovery, and they will make better software. And so you can see how this assumption of independent rediscovery then drives the outcome of these models. Why might independent rediscovery be low? Well, it's very, very hard to discover a vulnerability in a software system, especially one that you can exploit through, a chain reaction of holes. Or you could just say, listen, there's an infinite stock of vulnerabilities in commercial operating systems. So therefore, the likelihood of you discovering one that I've discovered is quite low, simply because it's a very large pool. You could think it's easy because we all have similar tools of detection. We can all write the same scripts for looking for buffer overflows, or there's just a finite number in commercial applications, and so if I find one, it's going to be similar to one that you find. So what we don't have is there's very little empirical understanding. There's only one paper that I really like by Andy Osmond, and in fact that wasn't even published. It's part of his dissertation. There have been some attempts to argue otherwise, but they tend to look at time as opposed to just the sheer likelihood of rediscovery. So how do we integrate rediscovery into this model? Well, we continue in both the Cyberhawk game and the Stockpile game. We're going to continue our probability of initial discovery. That's still our technical advantage. But now there is a single variable that's on both sides of the tree of just probability of rediscovery R. And if R is high, you're likely to see rediscovery, and you're likely to end up in this portion of the tree. And if R is low, you're just unlikely to ever get to these subtrees. Again, we have a symmetric graph, and this also applies to the earlier game of stockpiling. So how does that change the equilibria that we talked about earlier? Well, I'm going to focus on the attack, the mutual offense where we don't see any defensive player. And in the stockpiling game, again, we have technical competence, and this is our delta, our social cost. And each of these bands is the probability of rediscovery. And what we see here is when probability of rediscovery is low, you're going to have a very aggressive posture. Very few people are going to play defensively. You're willing to tolerate a much higher social cost. When the probability is high, you're going to have someone who has an interest in playing defensively for a much lower social cost. So this is a very interesting point here, that rediscoveries is now not just something that's useful for building our theoretical models, but this can actually have a real impact in what we might do against a cyber adversary. So in revisiting the Cyberhawk game, and again looking at attack, we see very similar results. When probability of rediscovery is low, this is the zone of playing attack. People are going to be far more aggressive. Whereas when the probability of rediscovery is high, we're going to have a much narrower band of people seeking out the attempt. Why? Because you're just not likely to end up in that corner of the tree where you fear someone else. So you're going to look after only your first order threats of an attack. You're not going to worry about a counterattack. Okay. Any questions on this component? So now let's step back from our models and think about what they may tell us. First thing we found from these models is that no one's really playing defensively. You're never going to find an area where we can guarantee or even expect strong defensive posturing in this area where you have a decision maker that must choose between playing aggressively and playing defensively. People are just have an incentive, as I've currently framed these models, and again, we can critique the models, and I hope you will, to attack. Second, perceptions matter. Social cost and technology competence, all of these are based on subjective values. Now, I've had, for the convenience of these models, a single variable for the relative degree of technical competence and aggressiveness, and social cost as well. Now, what's interesting about social cost is you sort of say, well, technical competence, one party can impact by trying to signal either higher or lower competence. But what's interesting is you can also signal social cost. For example, Russia's tacit acceptance of a high degree of cybercrime emanating from inside its borders could be seen in one way as an attempt to raise the social cost for everyone else of having an unsecured system. Similarly, if they were to crack down, that could be seen as an effort in lowering the social cost, which, as we've shown, may not be optimal for a world where we have cyber commands who are discovering lots and lots of new vulnerabilities and deciding whether to attack or defend them. Now, I want to talk about transparency because this is one of the key things that is usually discussed in any arms control approach. So arms control doesn't work unless you have some way of verifying your opponent's state. What does transparency mean in this context? Well, it means the ability to understand your relative technical ability compared to the other person. Now, what's interesting is this secrecy can be good or bad in this model. We can tell a story each way. For example, secrecy can be bad because if you think back to all of these equilibrium models, we're the worst off when both parties are of roughly equal technical competence. Well, if you don't know anything about your adversary, you may assume, well, you know, the default Bayesian operator is 50-50. So now if that's the assumption, then now moving from that 50-50 point can deliver a positive advantage because you have some chance of moving towards a world where someone has the inclination to play or adopt a defensive posture. However, secrecy can also be good. So overstating your threats. Overstating your threats can actually be a positive outcome. For example, there's been a lot of rabble-rousing in the US press about this great looming threat from China. And it's true that we have had numerous reports of exploits that have been traced back, although not with 100% certainty to the Chinese government, but we know that things are coming from some actor over there, whether it's public or private, explicit knowledge. However, we now see this sort of weekly on the editorial pages of the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal, and what does that mean? Well, now we've basically raised our perception of how the other person is going to act, as well as their technical competence. So overstating the threats can lead to the United States adopting a more defensive posture. And if it's a more defensive posture, if we've overstated them, then we're more likely to discover these threats than we would in the model because, to return to our equilibrium, we believe, for example, that we're down here when in fact we're up here. So we're going to be more likely to play defensively. That leads to a greater amount of defense, which editorially I believe is a good thing. So the other idea is dominance. Is this going to be the potential for a cyber Pax Romana, or a Pax Siberia, if you will? And usually we sort of see, at least inside the liberal Ivy Tower, that dominance and hegemony aren't very good things. However, all of our models point to the idea where when you have one party with technical dominance, you're going to have people playing a defensive posture far more often than when both parties are equally prepared. So that could be an argument saying that there is a greater social benefit to having one actor as being the dominant party. Yes? Yes. Yes.
There might still be a high probability that the other side will discover.
Yes. So that is exactly right. And the point that you were going to make, which is you have to multiply that times the probability of having a defensive posture matter, is one of the key limitations of this work, especially as we try to sort of play out the social costs. And all game theory models of the real world have astoundingly large numbers of critiques that one can make of them. Both parties have to play. They have to have a key understanding. You have to have a shared understanding. Most scholars of mutually assured destruction and the theory of deterrence say that we had to actually work very hard to teach game theory to the Russians during the Cold War. That we had to sit down and teach them the math, which now I think we think is obvious, but it only works, mutually assured destruction only works if both parties are playing it, right? And so we have to basically make sure that they're playing the same game. And also there's this point you just mentioned of low likelihood outcomes, that we're interested in thinking about playing defense, but we need to think about whether something is likely to happen. I also fully acknowledge that this has been a very US-centric talk. There are, according to some estimates, between 20 and 40 countries that have been developing or are currently in the process of developing intentionally and publicly cyber offensive capabilities. and we should think about how to extend this game to a multi-party domain. I think that this does hold for a multiple shot game, that the marginal impact of a single vulnerability can be thought about in a series. But the important part here is not just, are you going to discover multiple vulnerabilities? Pardon me. Sorry for whoever was listening to the headphones there. Are you going to discover multiple vulnerabilities? But once you discover a vulnerability and decide to launch an attack, well, that launches a very long multi-stage game that quickly grows high above my pay grade in terms of, shooting war and diplomacy and things like that. So that is one component, and in fact, thinking about what the next step of reaction is a very important part of understanding cyber strategy of the cyber warrior. So, trying to finish on time here. What I think we've done is taken a way of thinking about attack and defense in a new domain of cyber attack and said, listen, this is something that we should think about with game theory tools, but we can't use the traditional models of game theory in conventional defense because there are new trade-offs that we need to understand and introduce. And if we are going to shift to a model where we've unified attack and defense under a single decision maker, that may not improve cybersecurity. And if we're interested in an overall level of defense of more secure systems just as a global good, we may not end up down that road. And what I like to think is this is a starting point for people to use in understanding the incentives for building more secure systems. Alternatively, this will be the founding point in developing a new and twisted way of understanding cybersecurity that will take us down a long, dark road. I don't think that's the case. I think this is going to be this is a fun project that I look forward to continuing. And now I would love to take your questions. Joe.
So, Allan, you talked about manipulating the social cost. For example, Russia being a player that might be encouraging cyber criminals. But in doing so, they're not only changing the social cost for all players, but they're actually changing social cost for their adversary while retaining or controlling cybercrime in a domestic context and not exposing themselves to the same result.
Yes.
Not playing the same game.
Yes, you're right. That again, the conventional wisdom. It's very, very hard to get hard data on any of this stuff. It usually is. I talked to a guy. There's a group called the Old Crows, who you can get some very interesting stories from. But again, all very much off the record. That says that there's an informal bargain in Moscow that both sides know exactly where the chief bad guys are, and should any of the major targets turn towards Russia. And in fact, you see some evidence of this. There's relatively, the phishing sites tend not to be written in Cyrillic. They tend to be targeted in English language, disproportionately to what we know about international web banking and things like that. You see far fewer scams in Cyrillic. And in fact, there is, I can't remember the name, there's one malware package that looked for the installed, this was a while ago, so it probably predates state sponsorship. It was probably just a hacktivist approach, but it looked for the installed language. And if you had the Cyrillic language package installed in Windows, then the payload did not go off. It did still spread, which is why Russian networks fell down during whichever worm this was. But yes, but you're right, and having additional, the trade-off you have in any modeling approach is, I can add, 18 variables to this model. What that will actually introduce, other than the acknowledgement that, yeah, if you make things unfair, then one party benefits. Yes? All right, well, paper is posted to my website and Tyler's website and Ariel's website, and we'd love additional feedback. And thank you for dealing with me, and I hope I made some sense today.